Okay. Top of the hour, folks are coming in. Welcome, welcome. As folks are starting to join in, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself in the chat function, which you'll see along the bottom of the Zoom window. My name is Nick, and I'm going to kind of start that conversation there. Any questions that you have throughout the presentation, feel free to toss those in the chat, and I'll be reading them at a few scheduled breaks that we have. I'll be reading them out loud to Gary or answering them directly via the chat. As more folks are joining in, I'll just remind everyone again, if you wouldn't mind telling us your name, where you're calling in from, anything else you'd like us to know about you.
Susan from Akron, welcome. Hey.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Always
we
nice
did a
to
training at University of Akron a couple of years back, Susan. I don't know if you were part of that or not, but we trained about 25 or 30 folks there. OC, hey, welcome, man. Good to see you here. There's a blast from the past. Mark Siegel, business coach from New York. Welcome, Mark.
Awesome.
Carol,
yeah, thanks
Tampa.
for joining us, Mark. Wow, awesome. Really great.
Yeah. Andrea, Chilean. Hi,
Oh,
Andrea
wow.
here, Chilean, Paris. Okay, welcome, Andrea.
That's a cosmopolitan person right there. That's awesome.
Grand Rapids. Geddes Mohammed from California, CTE coordinator for charter school in San Bernardino County. Excellent.
Great.
Welcome, Geddes. Elizabeth from Atlanta. Sean from Tampa. Hey, when you guys are dropping your comments in there, just also like, if you just say some things about like what you're interested in, what your interests are here, it can help us kind of zero in on, are you interested in the Ice House? Are you interested in learning how to teach entrepreneurship? Are you learning how to develop it yourself? Just trying to get to know what folks are looking for here.
Exactly. And
interested in Ice House program for the college. Great.
Great. Okay, we'll just
Business
maybe
law.
wait another minute, Gare, and then we can kind of get rolling on the presentation.
Yeah.
Carol, yes.
We teach Ice.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Johannes here, Director of Schools Education of Invest in South Africa. Wow, welcome, Johannes. Johannes, you must be friends with Margay. Yes. So welcome to South Africa. We've done a couple of trainings with the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation in Johannesburg and Cape Town. Happy to have representation here. Elizabeth, teaching innovation and entrepreneurship with an eye towards exponential technologies and trends.
Nice.
Know of her. Okay, great.
And Bryant's chiming in on the Q&A saying he's teaching urban entrepreneurship. So thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we'll have something useful for you.
And then we've got Vineeth from India, a mentor to rural schools. Great. Planning to work on developing a simple entrepreneurship curriculum for middle school students. Awesome. Really interested in the entrepreneurship information teaching courses, and the premise that is used course is that it is a must course for all students. Absolutely. That's definitely a must course for all students. I wholeheartedly agree. Cynthia from Seattle, Washington. Who owns the Ice House? Want motivation to stay focused, set and achieve goals in my new coaching business. Awesome. Great. Welcome, Cynthia. You're in the right place.
And Widad from Texas, Lamar Institute of Technology. Thank you for joining us. All right. We're about 5 minutes past the hour. So how about we get going on the presentation?
Yeah, let's go. And Mary, welcome from, I know, fellow Ohioan here in Newark.
Yes,
awesome.
Super excited to chat with you, Mary. Thanks for joining us. Awesome.
All right. So are we just going to go here, Nick? Or
Yeah,
what?
go ahead.
Ready,
I think
ready
we're
to roll?
good.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Let me figure out how best to share my screen. And thank you, Nick, for all the setup here. All righty. Nick, can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes, sir.
We're all good there? Okay, good. All right, we're going to jump right in here. I am super excited I love doing these webinars. It gives me a chance to interact with folks. I spend a lot of my time thinking and writing and reading, and webinars give me a chance to kind of pop my head up and connect with folks around these ideas. So thank you for joining us today. So really what this is about for me, I've been trying to figure out for almost 30 years. I've had this 30-year fascination with what I'll call underdog entrepreneurs. I wanted to understand how people who have no particular advantage in life manage to rise above their circumstances to create meaningful and prosperous lives. That's really the question, that the quest that I've been on for almost 30 years, since 1991, to sort of deconstruct the mindset and the methods of everyday entrepreneurs, people who might not have big ideas, they might not have Stanford MBAs or access to venture capital, but somehow they manage to find ideas, and they manage to bring these ideas to life in a way that benefits them and benefits their organizations, their communities, and society as a whole. So that's really what this is about for me. And I want to share with you some of what I've learned on this journey. So before we get started, a little bit about who we are. My name is Gary Schoeniger. I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We provide keynotes, workshops, and professional development programs, entrepreneurial leadership programs, faculty and professional development, workforce development programs. We are also the creators of the Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs, which many of you may or may not have heard of. So that's who we are. I also want to announce a new project that we just launched this week. It's called the Eli Entrepreneurial Mindset Gap Year Challenge. It's a full semester course that takes students. It's designed for students who may not be ready for college or who may be reluctant to return to college, to help them figure out how to create value, how to make themselves useful in highly resource-constrained, ambiguous circumstances where the rules aren't clear, the path is not well defined. So I'm excited about that. You can learn more about that on our website as well. If you have questions about it, I can answer them later on in the Q&A. So here we are. The world has changed in ways that now require everyone to think like an entrepreneur. And I'm italicizing the word think because I don't mean to say that we all need to start businesses per se. And honestly, by the end of this webinar, I hope I've convinced you that we should really make the word entrepreneur go away. So what I mean by that is that we have to stop thinking about entrepreneurship in a binary way, that you either are an entrepreneur or you're a worker, right? We've got to get away from that. Like, okay, some students might want to go on an entrepreneur track and start their own business, and everybody else goes on the employee track or the employment track or the job or career readiness track or whatever. Those two things need to stop thinking in that binary way, and I'll say more about that. So another way of saying what I just said is that the mindset that once enabled us to thrive is rapidly becoming obsolete. We can call it the prevailing mindset, we can call it the employee mindset, whatever you want to call it. But the mindset that was once necessary for us to succeed is now becoming obsolete. So when we look at the entrepreneurial person, what we see is someone that's optimally engaged. We see people who are able to identify and solve problems in resource-constrained environments where the rules aren't clear, the path is not well defined, right? So these are people that are not only inventing new products and services, that are creating jobs, in revitalizing our communities, solving problems. But they're also improving existing processes and procedures and existing products. So the bottom line here is that, entrepreneurial people are not only equipped with the attitudes and skills that enable them to adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing world, but they're equipped with the attitudes and skills that enable or empower them to make a greater contribution to the organizations, the communities, and the societies they inhabit. And there is unlimited global demand for those who can think like an entrepreneur, is essentially the bottom line. So in this webinar, I want to talk about 4 things. I want to redefine the term entrepreneurship in a way that anyone can embrace. I also want to identify the entrepreneurial skills that the world now demands. I should say the entrepreneurial attitudes and skills the world now demands. I also want to look at the critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset. We use that word liberally, but a lot of us don't understand what that means, and more importantly, where it comes from, how to develop it. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how to create effective entrepreneurial learning environments using the Ice House, the framework from the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program that we developed in 2010. We launched in 2011 with initial funding from the Kauffman Foundation. So let's get started. I'm going to begin by sort of combining, let's get the 2-for-1 special here. I'm going to redefine entrepreneurship. At the same time, I'm going to point to the attitudes and skills that the world now demands and sort of try to help make that connection. So I think a challenge for a lot of folks is the way in which we think about entrepreneurship, and what does that word conjure in your mind when you hear the word entrepreneur? What do you think about, right? For a lot of people, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but for many, it's sort of a frightening, intimidating thing, right? And it evokes the image of, the Silicon Valley whiz kid who comes up with some crazy new technology and gets millions of venture capital, and sort of this high growth, high tech, type entrepreneurship, and that's fine. That's definitely part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, if you will. But when we look closer at the data, it's a very, very small fraction of the entrepreneur ecosystem. And when we were at Kauffman, I did some digging there, and we found out that of the 500,000 or so new companies that are created in the US each year, a small fraction of a single % are created with venture capital. So part of the challenge that we face is there's this visibility versus representation issue that skews our thinking, not only about how to be entrepreneurial, but about who can be entrepreneurial. It seems very complicated. It seems reserved for these, young white alpha males who are at elite universities. That's certainly part of it, but it definitely skews our thinking about how to be entrepreneurial. Now, I want to use this slide to sort of come back to something I touched on a minute ago, which is, I've spent the last 10 years interviewing underdog entrepreneurs, and it's in the observation and analysis of these everyday unlikely entrepreneurs, the underdog entrepreneurs, whatever you want to call them, that really revealed something profound that I would have never gotten to had I been focused on, understanding the mindset of Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Richard Branson, right? And that's what I wanted to talk about today. It's like what we learned from the observation and analysis of these underdog entrepreneurs is utterly fascinating. And the implications of what we've learned reach far beyond the startup world, right? Yeah, it can definitely help you if you want to start a business. That's great. But it has major implications for leadership, for faculty development, teacher training, for the workforce development, right? This is a mindset that everyone needs to adapt and thrive in the 21st century. So I'm going to briefly touch base on a concept called transformation theory, which was developed by a guy named Dr. George Land, who's a systems scientist. And he came up with this idea of transformation theory as a way to explain the nature of change within any living system, right? A person, a company, an organism, whatever, right? And so I'm going to use Land's theory here for sort of two reasons. First of all, it's helpful. It was really helpful to me in my research to help disentangle entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills from managerial behaviors and skills. And so that in and of itself was a huge awareness for me. That's really where we began to realize that the attitudes, behaviors, and skills that are required to discover an opportunity are quite distinct from the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to exploit that opportunity. The former being entrepreneurial skills, the latter being managerial skills. Okay, so transformation theory, this is a brief overview. If you want to learn more about this, his book is called Breakpoint and Beyond, and you hear Ken Robinson mention it in his most watched TED Talk ever about how schools kill creativity. Okay, nevertheless, transformation theory works like this. According to Dr. Land, there are 3 phases of change. Wait a minute, I got to back up. I forgot something. So it's not only useful to sort of disentangle entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills from managerial, it's also very helpful as a framework for understanding change. And that's really perhaps the more important learning to be taken away from this theory. And I'm not going to do it any justice. I'm going to just skim across the top very briefly. Okay, back to the theory. What Land is saying is there are 3 phases of change. There's a discovery phase, there's a growth phase, and there's an obsolescence phase. Or in some cases, it's a reinvention phase. And this point right here, he would call a bifurcation point, right? This is the beginning of a new S-curve. So what Land is saying is that each of these 3 phases are unavoidable. They're unavoidable facts of life. What he's saying is that each phase requires separate rules for survival. And the trick to survival is to understand which phase you are in so that you know which rules to apply. Because the rules in phase 1 don't apply to phase 2, and the rules for success in phase 2 don't apply to phase 1, and the rules for success in phase 3 don't apply to phase 1, right? So that's really the key here. Now, these orange dots represent breakpoints, which are the moments in time when the rules for survival change. Now, it's worth mentioning that in Land's, in this graphic illustration, those breakpoints are obvious. They're clear, they're obvious. But in the real world, maybe not, right? You don't always get a memo in your inbox that the world has changed and you have to have a new mindset and new attitudes and new skills for survival. So in the real world, it's often much more subtle. So basically in the discovery phase, that's when we learn how to become useful. So if I back up just a second, if we apply, I'm applying this now to a human, right? Not an organism, but a human being, right? In the discovery phase, we learn how to become useful to other humans. And that's sort of a draw from something Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, like we all live by exchanging something useful with someone else, right? And so in the discovery phase, we learn how to become useful. Then then we go out into the world and use those skills to actually become useful, right? So You could go back and say the first break point here is your first real job out of college. You're now able to support yourself, right? See, the line's going down here because you're unable to support yourself in this discovery phase. Okay, so you get your first job, you're out in the world, and now you're learning how to become useful, and you get better and better and better at it. You grow, you advance in your career, you climb the corporate ladder, whatever the case may be, until one day the growth starts to slow and you hit the second break point, which is an indication that you're either becoming obsolete or that you need to reinvent yourself. Maybe you're going to retire. Maybe you just had one career, you're growing in your career, and then you retire and that's it. Or, you know, as we all know, shift happens and we have to reinvent ourselves, right? Now, the point that I want to draw into here is that most of us learned how to become useful to other humans within a highly stable, routinized, other-directed, rule-bound learning environment that taught us how to function in pretty much the same working environment, right? We were taught how to become useful to an employer who would tell us what to do. You know, we're going to exchange the useful knowledge we have with the employer, and we're going to work in this stable, routinized, other-directed, rule-bound working environment. And that's a broad, sort of a broad brushstroke here, but that's sort of the characteristics of the Industrial Revolution. But the point here is that Land makes that's so important is that we often get stuck at the second break point, right? We as a number of different scholars have thought about this and written about it, we respond inappropriately to change very often, right? So sometimes we've experienced lots of growth and we become arrogant and we dismiss the change, right? We're Kodak, we know everything there is to know about film. What is this digital nonsense, right? You know, sometimes we just deny it. Sometimes we become angry, we reject, we blame. And I think the most common inappropriate response to change is that we tend to double down on these column 2 beliefs and behaviors, right? We go into what Land called a siege mentality, where we double down on our prior beliefs. We just try to pedal a little bit faster. We ask everyone else to do a little bit more for a little bit less. You try to squeeze more out of the lemon we already have. And, you know, that works maybe for a minute, but it's really not going to, it's not sustainable, right? So the way Land put it was that nothing fails like success. What the genius of this thinking here is that what Land is saying is that the attitudes and skills that were essential for growth in column 2 are the attitudes and skills that will now prevent us from adapting, right? That's what he meant when he said nothing fails like success. They were absolutely necessary to succeed, but now these are the attitudes and skills that will prevent us from adapting when shift happens. In his excellent book, the author Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, he put it differently, in which he wrote, the values to which people cling most stubbornly under inappropriate conditions are those values that were previously the source of their greatest triumphs, right? You know, Darwin said it differently. Darwin said, right, it's not the smart or the strong that survive, it's the most flexible, any way you look at it, right? So the question becomes, how do we learn how to become useful outside of the norm? How do we learn how to become useful when the path isn't clear, when the rules aren't well established, when there isn't a well-defined path, right? That's really what entrepreneurial discovery is, right? Because entrepreneurs, just like anyone else, are figuring out how to make themselves useful to other humans. They're just doing it outside of the boundaries of known systems, of known processes and known procedures. And so the survival skills required to survive an entrepreneurial discovery are quite different from the attitudes and skills that are required to survive in school, right? Or to survive in the workforce, in the workplace. At least they were in the past. So here's what it looks like from an entrepreneurial perspective, right? The journey begins, the discovery process begins. We're trying to figure out how to make ourselves useful to other humans. And as I've said, we're doing this within a highly ambiguous, resource-constrained context. Now, those two factors you'll come to see are not incidental, they're optimal. Those are the conditions within which the entrepreneurial mindset is developed, right? You can think of it differently. If you have money and resources and time, you're not going on any kind of a discovery process. You can just use your money and your resources to make things happen, right? So it's the high degree of ambiguity and the resource constraints that forge the entrepreneurial mindset. So what are the rules? Okay, let me back up. The connection is found. So I said earlier, when you graduate from college, you get your first real job. That's evidence that you found a connection with your environment. Well, as an entrepreneur, the connection is found not when you get your first real job. Your connection is found when you have evidence that you've created something useful, right? Now, what does that evidence look like? That evidence could be anything. It could be money. I mean, most commonly, when people are paying you for something you created, that's evidence that it's useful. But if you work in an existing organization, if you've got buy-in, if the process is an improvement, you've got data, you've got users, you've got readers, you've got subscribers, there's evidence of usefulness. Now, the point here is simple. The entrepreneurial discovery process is an evidence-based process. I really don't care what the evidence you are seeking is. The point is that we're looking for some kind, that it's not gambling, it's not fortune telling. The entrepreneur is behaving like a detective who's trying to solve a mystery. So what are the rules for survival in this highly ambiguous, resource-constrained environment? How do you figure out how to move forward when the path isn't clear and the rules are not well defined? And again, the essence of what any of us are about is figuring out how to make ourselves more useful to more humans. That's what the journey is all about. So broadly speaking, it begins with problem finding skills. And this is an often overlooked aspect of this process that not a lot of people are talking about, but problem finding is perhaps more valued than problem solving skills, right? We got to find the problem first, and find the problem worth solving requires empathy, it requires curiosity, observation, and inquiry. Once we've identified a problem worth solving, that's when we start to develop the problem solving skills, which are, of course, creativity and innovation, critical thinking, experimentation and adaptation, what I call micro experimentation, collaboration and teamwork, networking, effective communication, and resourcefulness. There's a third category here, which is really about emotional intelligence and self-awareness, right? We need to learn how to be self-directed and to regulate ourselves. We need to develop an internal locus of control. I'll talk about that in a minute. Ambiguity tolerance. We need to learn how to function when the path isn't clear, when the rules are not well defined. We need to become self-directed learners, right? Self-directed lifelong learners. We need to become self-aware. We need to learn how to think about our own thinking. Metacognition is the fancy word. And lastly, we have to develop resilience. which stems from an optimistic explanatory style. And I'll talk about that maybe a little at the end. So the simple conclusion to this first part of the webinar is that I'm defining entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others, right? And the second half of this definition is perhaps more important than the first, which is that by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. I'll talk a little bit more about how that happens, a little bit about why that happens, why we become optimally engaged, right? But if you go back to the definition of entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others, anyone can embrace this definition. This is IQ independent, resource independent, it's situation independent. You can embrace this from where you stand right now, whether you work in an existing organization, whether you have your own business, whether you want to start a side hustle, it doesn't matter. The idea is we've got to figure out how to make ourselves more useful to more humans. Now, the second bullet point is that you'll recognize that these entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills are the 21st century skills that all, the thought leaders and academic and organizational thought leaders are talking about. We're seeing this from the World Economic Forum, OECD, and others are saying these are the skills that everyone is going to need to adapt and thrive in the 21st century. My point is that they're attitudes and skills that anyone can learn to develop. They're simply attitudes and skills that have historically been overlooked or ignored in our systems of education and our organizational thinking. So, people call them soft skills, people call them 21st century skills. I call them entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. They're all the same thing, right? So we redefined entrepreneurship as a self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. We identified the entrepreneurial skills that the world now demands. These are the problem-finding, problem-solving skills, the ability to function in ambiguity in resource-constrained circumstances. Now I want to talk a little bit about the critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset. What is an entrepreneurial mindset? Where does it come from? How do I develop it in myself and others? So I'll begin with this basic statement that we all have a mindset, yet few of us are aware of it, much less the ways in which it influences our behavior without our awareness. I mean, that's, I like to refer to this quote from Carl Jung in which he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So here are some fun facts about the mindset. I'll just give you a quick overview about what a mindset is. So it's a belief system that's unconsciously acquired. It's also uncritically acquired, right? We accumulate these beliefs without realizing that we're accumulating them, nor are we thinking critically about the beliefs, right? These beliefs become lodged beneath our conscious awareness, beliefs and assumptions and patterns of thinking and so forth. Our brains the way the mindset works is that our brains seek to automate as much as possible in order to reduce the cognitive load. So if you haven't read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, I highly recommend it. He won the Nobel Prize in economics as a psychologist. Pretty exciting work. But basically, our brains are inundated with data, like millions of bits of data every second. We can only process a few. So our brains need to filter out things. They need to process things. They need to reject things. And our brains need to automate as much as possible so that we can navigate life, right? So our brains learn to rely on heuristics like rules of thumbs and habitual patterns and mental models, right? So we can function on autopilot. Which leads me to the next point, that our mindset operates effortlessly without our awareness. But here's the glitch, right? Our mindset is subject to all manner of predictable errors of judgment. And this is what Kahneman and his colleagues have sort of documented over the last 20 years. Like all of the predictable ways, these cognitive biases are the predictable errors of judgment that we make. So the mindset, the way it works is like our mindset draws from our past to navigate the future. And if everything's going great in your life, then that's fine. Keep doing what you're doing. But it's when the world changes that we run into problems, because the mindset tends to function like a self-authoring software program that self-perpetuates. It creates this self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, that blocks out information that we need, right? And this is the way the cognitive biases work. So another way of saying this is that a mindset in motion tends to stay in motion. And the last point I want to make about this is that our mindset influences almost every aspect of our life, and it does so mostly without our conscious awareness. It influences our motivation, it influences our cognition, our emotions, and the choices we make. So here's a complex definition of mindset, which I adapted from Edgar Schein's definition of culture, because culture is sort of collective mindset, right? So he defined culture in this way, and I just modified it to define a mindset as a basic of pattern assumptions learned by an individual as he or she solved problems of external adaptation and internal integration that worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore assumed to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. Look, I know that's a bit of a clunky definition, but it's very, very precise. So I try to simplify it here and just saying that a mindset is the underlying beliefs and taken for granted assumptions that influence our behavior largely without our awareness, right? So it works kind of like the iceberg, right? On the surface are the visible artifacts and the observable behaviors. That's what you can see and hear and touch. Beneath the surface, lies our explicit knowledge and our espoused values. This is what we say we believe. This is what we say we value. This is what we know that we know. That's explicit knowledge and espoused values. But our mindset is at the base of the iceberg. This is our implicit knowledge, the deeply held values and taken for granted beliefs and tacit assumptions that we may not even be aware of. So, let's say, for example, we all know someone who's a chronic complainer or just somebody who's, complaining all the time, very pessimistic, right? That's what you see on the surface. And then what do they tell you? What is the reason for their misery, right? Well, they're blaming their wife or their husband or their kids or their boss or whatever. Those are their explicit beliefs, their espoused values, right? But at the base of the iceberg, there's something else going on there, perhaps, which is maybe a helpless orientation, maybe a sense of an external locus of control, which is a deeply held belief that fate or luck or circumstances or powerful others somehow control our lives, right? But that person may not be aware of those deeply held beliefs. So another way to think about the mindset is a belief system that is perfectly designed to create the outcomes that it's creating, right? So what shows up here is less likely to be the result of our explicit knowledge and espoused values, more likely to be the result of our implicit knowledge, deeply held values, taken for granted beliefs, and tacit assumptions. That's briefly how it works. So in our work, we look at 5 of what I would call critical dimensions of a mindset, right? These are self-efficacy beliefs, which is sort of a fancy way of saying domain-specific confidence, right? High self-efficacy, low self-efficacy. maybe low self-efficacy is looked at like helpless orientation. Perceived locus of control, right? Do you believe that you're in control of your life, or do you believe that fate, luck, circumstances, or powerful others are controlling your life, right? Again, we're not necessarily conscious of these beliefs. We're not walking around saying, hey, my name's Gary, I have an external locus of control. But if you pay attention, you can see it in the behavior, you can hear it in the language, right? Another way of thinking about the mindset is that our behavior betrays our core beliefs. A fixed growth mindset. This is from the work of Carol Dweck at Stanford, right? Do we believe that our intelligence is finite, or do we believe that we can grow and develop and adapt through deliberate practice, right? These deeply held, mostly unconscious beliefs have an enormous impact on the type of goals we set for ourselves. Are we intrinsically or extrinsically motivated, right? This is the goals that we pursue have an enormous impact on our level of motivation. Again, we're not aware of this. And then lastly, the resilience. Do you have an optimistic explanatory style, which leads to resilience? Or do you have a pessimistic explanatory style? So essentially, what's the story you tell yourself when you find yourself in difficult circumstances? You tell yourself, oh, this always happens to me? Or do you tell yourself, I've got to find a way, right? That's one's optimistic, one's pessimistic. The difference in life outcomes is just unbelievable here. I mean, look at the work Martin Seligman has done at UPenn in positive psychology. Resilience has an enormous impact on our health and psychological well-being. So, having interviewed all of these entrepreneurs, it seems to me that it all begins with this core assumption, which is usually not, the entrepreneur themselves is not consciously aware of. This is a tacit assumption. But it looks something like this, that it's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful to others. And the more useful I become, the better off I'm going to be, right? And so what we see if we go up to 30,000 feet, what the entrepreneur is doing is searching. It's the discovery process, right? They're searching for the intersection between their interests, their abilities, and the needs of other humans. And in that sphere, in that overlap, is where they become optimally engaged. So another way to think about this is what keeps the entrepreneur in this state of optimal engagement is the compelling nature of the goal they're pursuing, right? So if we get challenged too much, if the challenge that we're facing is too great above our skill level, we'll sort of quit. We'll become anxious and we'll opt out. If our skill level exceeds the challenge, we'll become bored and disengaged, right? Well, the entrepreneur finds this state of optimal engagement, what Csikszentmihalyi called the flow state, right? They become optimally engaged because of the compelling nature of the goal they're pursuing. So, to conclude this portion of the program, to look at the 5 dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset, what we see in the entrepreneur is a very high degree of self-efficacy, perceived self-efficacy, an internal locus of control, a growth mindset. They are intrinsically motivated, which means the task itself is intrinsically rewarding. They're not just motivated by money. It's a purpose-driven component to the work. And lastly, they become highly resilient. They develop an optimistic explanatory style. Now, here's the punchline, right? Before I get to questions, the punchline is this. When we look at the entrepreneurial mindset and we see these things, we make what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. We think, okay, you read these articles all the time. To be a successful entrepreneur, you got to have high self-efficacy, growth mindset, blah, 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 blah. Well, it's not really true, right? We're mistaking the effect for the cause, right? The entrepreneurial mindset is an effect of the entrepreneurial pursuit. It's not the cause of the behavior, right? The cause of the behavior stems from our innate desire to self-actualize, our tendency towards growth. That's where the desire comes from, right? That's where the initial behavior comes from. The point I just wanted to make here is that the entrepreneurial mindset is the result of entrepreneurial activity, not the cause. So let's stop thinking about a do you or don't you have an entrepreneurial mindset, right? This is something anyone can develop. So I'm going to pause here for just a few minutes to see if we have any questions or comments about this first half of the webinar. I think I covered all the ground here. We redefined entrepreneurship. We talked about the entrepreneurial attitudes and skills that are 21st century skills. We talked about the critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset. So what questions do you have?
Yes, we've got a really great one to start things off from Amelia. Do you find entrepreneurial skills to be different in a full market versus in a recession? My hypothesis is that in a recession, you have a different necessity. So many entrepreneurs become so not by explicit choice, but by circumstance.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, it's exactly that. But so I want to use that comment, which is a beautiful question or comment. It's look, if your life is going perfect, if you love your job, you have security, you're well paid, you have satisfaction from your work, there is absolutely no reason to be innovative and entrepreneurial. Keep doing what you're doing. The need to be innovative and entrepreneurial comes when it always arises from some dissatisfaction with the status quo. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe you hate your job. Maybe you stumbled into a problem and you found a solution and it can benefit other people. But it always stems from a dissatisfaction with the status quo. So to the point is, people lose their jobs and it forces them out into the world with a sharp stick where they now have to figure out how to become useful to other humans. It breaks my heart. I see this every day in the media. There are good, intelligent people that are so bound up in column 2 thinking. They're so steeped in the employee mindset that they're stuck when they lose their job. When there's not someone there to tell them how to become useful, they're lost. And that's really it's a beautiful question. So thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Similarly related, Chris is asking, do you find the type of entrepreneurial skills vary between cultures and motivated people in different financial circumstances?
I'm not seeing a lot of cross-cultural differences. I think there are some. I came across a guy, I interviewed a guy at Case Western, Richard Boyatzis. He was doing some of the emotional intelligence work with, I forgot the guy's name, the emotional intelligence guy. But anyway, and Boyatzis had done a study where he looked at entrepreneurial inclination according to religion. And that was interesting, right? And according to his study, that your religious affiliation had some effect on your ability to be innovative and entrepreneurial, or your willingness to be in any case. But other than that, I don't know of any real major cross-cultural differences. I remember doing some lecturing and training in Azerbaijan and Tbilisi for the State Department and finding young entrepreneurs that were just completely on fire. They have different, challenges. They have different levels of like corruption and other obstacles. The challenges they're facing might be different. But I'll use the question, Nick, to really, what I've come to believe in my observation and analysis of these everyday entrepreneurs is that the entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit, right? It's not just in some of us, it's in all of us. And it comes from this innate, Maslow talked about, this natural tendency towards growth, towards self-actualization. It's in every living thing. Walk outside, you'll see a plant trying to grow up in a crack in the asphalt, right? That's really what this is all about, in my view.
Sure. A couple more great questions related. I love it when this happens, when a good question gets the conversation rolling. From Daryl, can you speak more to our entrepreneurship journey as an opportunity to solve problems? He believes there was a slide that already talked about this, but is having some internet issues. So if you could just kind of recap that of the journey of entrepreneurs as an opportunity to solve problems.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about this in another way, and thank you for the question. It's like this. I'll frame the answer a little bit differently, but I've interviewed a lot of entrepreneurs, and most of them had some kind of failure in their history. And what I've gleaned from my observation and analysis is that the recipe for failure is as follows, is thus. I want to open a business because I'm good at doing X. So I want to open a business that does X, right? Or I want to open a coffee shop because I hate my job and I don't want to work too hard. I don't want to drive too far. I want to just kind of hang out, And so I'm going to open a coffee shop. And that's the recipe for failure is I'm trying to open a business to solve my own problem, right? And so the ones that fail are the ones that find a solution and then go looking for the problem. That's a really, really risky, that's gambling, right? And a poor form of it to boot. The ones that succeed find the problem first, right? And they validate the problem, they test, they experiment, they do a little bit of ad hoc research to sort of validate that there are lots of people that have this problem, right? And so, in my thinking and writing and lecturing about entrepreneurship, I'm forever trying to break these concepts down to first principles, right? So I'm going to go back to my Adam Smith quote. We all live by exchanging. So the question now becomes, what is it that we're exchanging? And with whom are we exchanging it, right? And so once people realize that there are 7 billion people on the planet, you probably have access to about half of them through the internet. And they all have needs. And your job is to go out there and figure out how you can leverage your natural interests and your natural abilities in ways that benefit other humans. And that's sort of the moment the cage door flies open, right? That's the moment you realize, there's nothing stopping you from making yourself more useful to more people. You don't need money to do that. You don't need to quit your job to do that. You don't need to drop out of school to do that. You don't need to be a genius to do that. You don't need venture capital to do it. You just need to shift your thinking towards problems. What's missing? What's broken? The psychologist Ellen Langer said, assume everything you're doing could be done better. That's the place to start. Thank you for that wonderful question.
Absolutely. One more question that I think is going to be a nice segue into the next section. And then and then I think we're good to move forward. But that question is, what can we do to help shift people from an employee to an entrepreneurial mindset?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is a good segue, Nick. That's a good call. So that's what we designed the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program for. And that's really, really a good question. Um, I think a start is to help people realize that your mindset is a belief system. And it's a belief system that is perfectly designed to create the outcomes that it's creating. So I think that's the first step in the journey. But I'm going to use your question to sort of segue into how to create the entrepreneurial learning environments that are designed to do just that. So let's get to the last bullet point here, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end as well. So I'm not sure if all of you have heard of the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. This came about as part of my own discovery process. I was interviewing entrepreneurs around the United States for a project for the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute. I stumbled into a guy named Clifton Talbert, who's a very successful entrepreneur who attributed his entrepreneurial mindset to his uncle Cleve as he came of age in the Mississippi Delta as an African-American in the Jim Crow South. And a few years later, Clifton and I co-authored a book called Who Owns the Ice House? 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. And with initial funding from the Kauffman Foundation, we created this curriculum called the Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs that are now being used all over the world in so many different ways. I've listed a few here. But I'm going to talk about the Ice House program as a framework for creating effective entrepreneurial learning environments, right? So we have now 4 different versions. We have the original edition, a student success edition, which is a really cool program for high school students or incoming college freshmen as a seminar or student success program to teach them how to think like an entrepreneur, to succeed in school as well as in career and life. We have a small business edition, which is strictly designed for people who are ready to start a business. And then there's a middle school edition that came about after a very successful 1,000-student pilot in the Erie Public School System, Erie, Pennsylvania. So I want to first talk about entrepreneurial learning. I mean, we are the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, after all. But what I want to talk about is that, I've observed entrepreneurs now. I've interviewed maybe 500 entrepreneurs across the globe over the last decade. When we go up to 30,000 feet and observe the entrepreneurs, or like maybe another way to think about it is, if you're out on safari with night vision goggles, observing the entrepreneurs, here's how they tend to learn. They're practicing experiential learning. They're doing project-based learning, peer-to-peer learning, and self-directed learning. They have no idea that's what they're doing, but that is what they're doing. And this brings me to a point this is how humans learn in a natural environment when the rules aren't clear and the path is not well defined, right? So experiential learning, and this was really brought forth by David Kolb, who's here at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. You have this experience, something's not working, something's broken or could be improved. You take some time to reflect and think about it. You design an experiment, you test it, and you learn from the experiment, and this becomes like a flywheel of entrepreneurial thinking, right? This is in academic terms, but it's pretty much maps perfectly to what entrepreneurs are naturally doing in the wild, right? They're also doing what educators would call project-based learning, right? Which is student-centered. It occurs in small groups. The teacher is not the subject matter expert. They're the facilitator. They're the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. That's super important. The problems are introduced early in the learning process. It's the problem solving that stimulate the problem solving skills. And as a result, new knowledge is obtained. That's, again, precisely what entrepreneurs are doing naturally. But here's the key. right? They're solving ill-structured problems. These are problems that don't have a single right answer. They're open-ended and complex. They're real world. They require collaboration. They continuously evolve with new information. They spark interest and controversy, and they engage questions. So that's a super important part. It's the ill-structured nature of the problem. You can't go to the library and find the answer in a book. Your professor doesn't know what to tell you to get the A. It's ambiguous, right? We've got to figure out how to separate signal from noise. And that's, again, a skill that has historically been overlooked or under, appreciated or rejected in historically. Entrepreneurs are also engaged in peer-to-peer learning, and again, that's not what they call it, but if you look at the research on peer-to-peer learning, what Eric Mazur and his colleagues have figured out that peer-to-peer learning increases knowledge retention by turning passive note-taking students into active de facto teachers who explain their ideas to each other. That's what we see in the entrepreneurs. They're creating peer-to-peer learning environments where they're teaching each other what they're learning. And lastly, we see a self-directed learner, right? The entrepreneurs tend to be very engaged learners, and it's a self-directed learning. We designed our curriculum around the work of Gerald Grow, which is to say that we designed the curriculum to help shift the learner from a state of dependent learning to interested, to involved, and ultimately to self-directed learning. And that's really, ultimately the self-directed learning is proven when the course is over and the student continues on the project beyond the course, right? So those are the 4 basic learning methods that are the structure of our methodology in the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. So we have some pretty straightforward objectives. We want to start by redefining entrepreneurship and anyone can embrace, and that's our definition of self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. We wanted to inspire the students by exposing them to real-world examples, what I call relatable social models, right? That's a super important factor here. The entrepreneurial models we expose the students to should match, they should be relatable. Like, stop talking about Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and Henry Ford, and let's start looking at, entrepreneurs that the students can relate to. We're going to immerse them in real world entrepreneurial processes. I'm going to focus on the mindset, right? Look, if I want to open a cupcake shop and you want to open a software company, totally different paths we're going to be on. But if we understand the logic is where I can make it my own and make it more broadly applicable. We also designed our courses to connect the classroom with the local entrepreneurial community, again, to bring the relatable social models into the learning experience. And lastly, we wanted to develop a program that did not require the instructor to be a subject matter expert, right? So it's a facilitated delivery. It's not instructed delivery. 4 key concepts that I borrowed from Albert Bandura when helping, this is what he calls guided mastery, right? We want the person to have sort of what he called an efficacy moment, right? A small win. I got to feel the bat hit the ball once so I can see that it's possible. I don't have to start a company and be in revenue and win all these business plan competitions. I just need some small efficacy moments, right? And these efficacy moments should come with some degree of effort. They shouldn't come too easily, but they shouldn't be so far out of reach that they give up before they have an efficacy moment. The second concept here is exposure to the relatable social models, which I've already talked about. The third thing we need is our mentorships. We need people who believe in us. ask probing questions that'll encourage us to dig deeper, run faster, and jump higher. And then lastly, we need the ability to regulate ourselves, to become a little bit more self-aware. So, core concepts in the Ice House program and in any teaching methodology, exposed to these 8 core concepts that we gleaned from hundreds of interviews with entrepreneurs, and I'll walk you through those in just a second. Immerse the students in real-world experiences and reinforce with the examples, and then encourage personal reflection. So, after interviewing these entrepreneurs, at first I started interviewing entrepreneurs and I started hearing a bunch of crazy cool stories, right? People that have no money, they have, the idea is not really a big idea, but slowly over time, maybe years, the idea evolves and they keep scratching away and it exposes something. And so over time, as I started to, interview 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 entrepreneurs, I started to recognize common patterns. And what we were looking for here are common and replicable factors, right? So these are things that are IQ independent, that are resource independent, that are situation independent, that anybody could apply in any situation. And I'm going to walk you through those now, right? And I'm going to be very brief, but there's a lot to unpack in each one of these. And I won't have time to get into that today. But the very foundation of this entrepreneurial process is the power to choose. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you interview an entrepreneur, almost immediately they'll start to talk about some kind of a compelling goal. They're choosing a compelling future. They're not allowing their circumstances to dictate. They're pursuing a compelling goal. And that, my friends, is the linchpin. And I cannot overemphasize that. They don't realize that's what's happening, right? But what they're doing is they're orienting themselves towards a positive future orientation, right? They're choosing a compelling goal. So another way to think about this as a rhetorical question is, do you have a compelling goal? Like a goal that gets you out of bed on Friday night or Sunday morning, or it's exciting, it's something you work on in the margins that you're constantly trying to figure out. Like, that's really the linchpin. All right. The second thing we notice is that they recognize problems as opportunities. Most of us, in the prevailing paradigm, the prevailing mindset, we look at problems as things to be avoided, where the entrepreneur looks at problems as things to be approached. They look at every problem, every frustration, every unmet need they encounter as a possible opportunity. And so they're constantly going through these cognitive processes of looking for problems. And it requires, like I said, empathy, right? There's a bias towards action. They don't spend a lot of time planning. Instead, they test their ideas. And what this reveals is that they're learning through a process called effectual reasoning. They're learning through micro experimentation, because the opportunities they pursued there's no data. So planning doesn't really work. They have to learn by doing, right? The fourth idea that we've gleaned from these interviews is that they're learning machines. The entrepreneurs are constantly learning, but they're not necessarily learning in formal ways. They're learning through informal and non-formal means. They're learning implicitly through their experience when they're not trying to learn. They're learning from YouTube videos. They're learning from, online courses, from audio books, from lectures, from whatever. They're constantly learning. So we see this, the looking for opportunities, trying things, and learning as sort of the loop, right? If I had to summarize the entrepreneurial process in 3 sentences, it would look like this. You got to be looking for problems to solve. You got to be trying lots of things, and you always have to be learning. You got to be looking, you got to be trying, and you got to be learning. That's really the engine of entrepreneurial thought and process. As a result, they learn to become resourceful, right? They learn how to use whatever resources they have at hand to make things work. They learn how to become reliable, and they build a brand within and a reputation as being reliable. And it's that reputation that starts to generate luck. They start to create their own luck by building a brand. They tend to create their own sort of organic learning communities, like a community of practice, you might call it, right? They join like formal or informal entrepreneurial peer groups so they can learn from each other. And lastly, so many of the entrepreneurs we interviewed will say over and over and over again, it just came down to a refusal to give up. I just refuse to give up. So it's a brief flyover. Those are the 8 core concepts that we distilled from hundreds of interviews with entrepreneurs. Those sort of become the core concepts or the core competencies that become the basis for entrepreneurial, the Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs. So then we immerse the students in real world entrepreneurial experiences, right? Helping the students traverse this highly ambiguous resource constrained discovery process, how to figure out how to make yourself useful in highly ambiguous resource constrained circumstances. And we do that using a tool we call the Ice House Opportunity Discovery Canvas. It's a derivative of Alexander Osterwalder's business model canvas. We took the business vernacular out of it, broke it down into 3 phases. It starts with problem finding. Once you find the problem, then you go into solutions and experimenting with solutions. And only once you've got evidence of usefulness, right? That's kind of in box 6, that you then go into the advocacy and implementation phase, like start to convince others that you have a solution, right? Problem finding, problem solving, and then connecting and advocating for the idea. So this is really a very simple tool that enables students to get out of the building, to test their ideas, talk to people, and test them in the real world. All right, then the third point here that I want to talk about is reinforcing with relatable examples. Throughout the Ice House program, the students are learning from a wide variety of everyday unlikely entrepreneurs. From Dawn Haffiker, a disabled veteran that was wounded in the Iraq War in 2004, started a company as a way to help other veterans who were still, in active duty, to Brian Scudamore over on the right, the guy that started 1-800-GOT-JUNK as an 18-year-old kid with $1,000. There's a number, we have about 14 or 15 different case studies embedded right in the program. It enables the students to learn from the firsthand experience of other unlikely entrepreneurs. And the last component of the Ice House program is we encourage personal reflection, right? So this comes back to my point. We encourage the students constantly to think about where are your natural interests and your abilities, and how can you find the intersection? We're constantly asking the students to reflect on that, to find that intersection, which is where we become optimally engaged. So going back to the beginning, if we want to understand why entrepreneurs are so resilient and resourceful, such creative, critical thinkers, so why all of the attitudes, behaviors, and skills that we recognize that we need in ourselves, our children need, our students need, our workforce need. If you want to understand where those attitudes and skills come from, it comes from one simple factor. It's the nature of the goal the entrepreneur is pursuing. It has very little to do with their dispositional traits. It has everything to do with the goal they're pursuing, right? So we're asking the students what I asked you a minute ago. Do you have a compelling goal? What does the future look like for you, right? What if you had no obstacles? How would you use your interests and abilities to serve others. That's the basic reflection concept. So since we've launched Ice House in 2011, we've trained more than 2,600 facilitators around the world. We've got partners in India, in Australia, in South Africa. The program is being used in ways that I could never have imagined. I just wanted to give you this little visual to talk about the scope of the Ice House program. It's been featured on NPR, CNN, USA Today, the Huffington Post. The former vice president of entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation, Tom Rue, was invited to present the Ice House program to the United Nations General Assembly in New York, as well as to a papal council on peace and justice at the Vatican. I was invited about 3 years ago to present the Ice House program to a panel at the European Commission in Brussels. So it's really, what the Kauffman Foundation said, what Tom Rue said about the Ice House program at Kauffman was that it's redefining entrepreneurship in classrooms and communities around the world. Now, I'll show you a little quick sample. The middle school version, Erie, Pennsylvania. Now several thousand middle schools, 13-year-olds are going through the middle school version of the Ice House program. Here's a quick snapshot of how this is impacting the lives of these young kids. You want to look more into that if you Google search Ice House Erie, you'll see more about that project there. Prepa Tech is the private high school feeder system of Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico, one of the most entrepreneurial colleges in the world. They have 31 campuses scattered across Mexico. They put about 15,000 students through the Ice House program, high school students. As they're leaving Prepa Tech, about to go to university, they're using the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program there. Community college. Dr. Lance Bolton at Pikes Peak Community College did a 1,000-student blind study with 1,000 developmental students, saw a 28% impact on students persisting from the first semester to the second semester in community colleges. City government, this is one I never saw coming, right? The city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, wanted to make their city government more innovative and entrepreneurial. They put initially 100 workers through the program. They were so impressed by the outcome and the impact of that. They're now putting 6,000, all 6,000 city government employees through the program. It's led by a guy named Tom Darling, who was the facilitator at Central New Mexico Community College. So I mentioned Tom Rue a minute ago. He was the former VP of entrepreneurship at Kauffman. He's now leading a foundation in North Carolina called NC IDEA. They're doing an enormous project in North Carolina. They are committed to transforming 100,000 North Carolinians with an entrepreneurial mindset using the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. You can learn more about what they're doing. We've trained about 250 facilitators from K-12, colleges, universities, nonprofit organizations all across North Carolina. It's a really cool initiative. Keep your eyes on that one. Tom's doing amazing things there. So if you want to learn how to engage with us, right? An easy way to do that is go on Amazon and buy a copy of Who Owns the Ice House. It really talks about the 8 life lessons through the eyes of a single story of Clifton Talbert and the influence of his Uncle Cleve. You can get it's in Kindle. You can get a softcover, hardcover, or Audible version. We also have a self-paced version of the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. You can enroll on that on our website. It's $99. You can just go to the website, sign up, and take the program. If you want to learn how to bring the Ice House program to your classroom or your community, we offer a 3-day facilitator training program. We do these trainings privately all over the world. We're almost constantly doing these for organizations around the world. About 3 or 4 times a year, we have public facilitator trainings. So if you want to bring us into your organization to do a training, you can contact us to do that. If you want to just send a few people, our next one is actually in November, but it's sold out. So unfortunately, we can't let you in the November training, but the next one is in February. I would encourage you to sign up as soon as you possibly can, because more and more of these trainings are overselling. So beyond that, again, we offer keynotes, workshops, and professional development programs around entrepreneurial leadership, faculty and professional development, and workforce development programs. So that's what we do. That's who we are. I'm going to pause now and once again ask whatever questions you might have that I can answer as we wind down this webinar. Give my vocal cords a rest.
Absolutely. Again, a couple really great questions coming through. Some of which you've touched on the answers for, but definitely want to dig into them further. Where's the first one? So this is a good one about student engagement. How can you foster an entrepreneurial mindset when students are motivated by grades?
Oh boy, that's really the $1 million question, right? So that's why there's actually material in the Ice House program to expose students to the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So if you're extrinsically motivated, that means you're motivated for some separable reward, like $1 or a grade, right? Versus someone who's motivated by the learning itself. And so I think the first step is to make the students aware of that, right? And this question really strikes at the heart of what we're trying to do here. And that is to shift students away from being extrinsically motivated to becoming intrinsically motivated. So here's how I'll answer your question. Use the Ice House program, first of all. But a simpler way to think about this is I'm going to borrow from Jaime Casap, the former head of Google Education, in which he said, stop asking your students what they want to be when they grow up, and start asking them what problems they want to solve and what do they need to learn in order to solve those problems. You'll see a totally different level of engagement. Thank you for that question.
Absolutely. Okay, next question, Gary. Trying to ask these in order. Since the ultimate goal is to develop the mindset to figure out the ambiguous and stay motivated to be more useful, is there a method to assess or track whether or not learners are making progress?
Well, yeah, that's a tricky question, but sometimes like our obsession with measurement actually interferes with the development, right? And so, we have some tools that we've developed to sort of, you can measure perceived self-efficacy. You can measure locus of control. I mean, you can measure like optimism versus pessimism. You can measure fixed versus growth mindset. These things are measurable, and we have tools that enable you to do that. But so I would say, just be careful how often you're trying to measure that. It's just, there's a lot of data out there to support the idea that once students are exposed to entrepreneurial curriculum, all their other academic scores tend to go up. They tend to become more intrinsically motivated to learn.
Absolutely. As we build more experiential learning environments without a subject matter expert and perhaps no right answers, what are the best methods for student evaluation? Just furthering the measurement tool. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of the Canvas process and that project-based learning.
Yeah, that's where I was going. So one of the things I say to in our facilitator training, or people come to the training to become facilitators, is like, you can use the Ice House Opportunity Discovery Canvas, but I'm trying to discourage using it as like a business plan competition, right? That to me is more like a beauty contest. And to me, this is not about who's got the best idea, because good ideas are the result of lots of bad ideas. So if somebody's got a good idea, that's a random event in most cases, right? And so what we want the students to go through this course, if a student goes through the course over 16 weeks, a full semester, and they come back and they say, we looked at this idea, we looked at it this way, we looked at it that way, we tried this, we tried that, we pivoted, we turned, we looked inside out, upside down, and we think it's a bad idea. I think they're deserving of the same high marks as someone who comes right out of the gate with a good idea that has validation. This is the way to teach critical thinking. This is a way to teach resilience. It's not really about teaching you how to run a business. It's teaching you how to figure out how to separate signal from noise, how to function in ambiguity when the rules aren't clear and the path is not well defined. That's the ultimate outcome. And so, and I think it takes a decade to develop an entrepreneurial mindset, right? I mean, this is not something that happens overnight. It's not something, you can't say, oh, I took this course and now I have an entrepreneurial mindset. Like, it doesn't happen that way. You develop an entrepreneurial mindset by being in the arena, by functioning in this highly ambiguous, resource-constrained circumstances over a long period of time. But the other side of the equation is you'll see a spike in student engagement because we are naturally inclined to pursue our own interests and our own abilities in ways that benefit the greater good. We do not need to be coerced to do that. We are naturally, intrinsically inclined to do that. So entrepreneurial learning relies less on those carrot and stick learning methods, right? Part of my mission here is to help educators understand this, that humans are no different than any other mammal, and that we're all equipped with both the desire and the capacity to learn everything we need to learn in order to adapt and thrive in our environment. And we often forget, we lose sight of the extent to which these rule-bound, these intrusive, rule-bound, other-directed learning systems interfere with that or inhibit or thwart that natural tendency to learn, right?
Absolutely. Okay, we've got 3 questions that have some interrelation, so I'm going to try my best to interweave them. So bear with me, Gary. Many of my students are very low socioeconomic African-American students. She has noticed that the students who have more resources in their background have more self-efficacy and ability to self-regulate and the luxury to fail. Failure is an option for them. But this is anecdotal. So she's wondering, have we seen this as well? And then to kind of tie into that, how does this align with other at-risk or underserved populations in urban and rural communities? We've got a couple of questions about urban and rural impact and underserved groups.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to say here. That's a really a good question. And here's what I've noticed, what I've gleaned from my study of these underdog entrepreneurs. They've figured out how to turn the adversity into an advantage, right? It's the lack of resources and the lack of experience, the naivete, that empowers them to try things that people with money may not try. It empowers them to try things that experts may not be willing, may dismiss, right? But at the same time, what we also have to understand is learned helplessness, right? I mean, you can't really talk about entrepreneurship without talking about default helplessness. And that is the deeply held belief that nothing I will do will matter, right? And so that's where the guided mastery comes in. For folks who are teaching the Ice House program to people who are dispossessed or locked out or left behind, like marginalized people, you go by that guided mastery, right? You help them find some little efficacy moment. You expose them to other people who come from similar or worse circumstances. You believe in them, you work with them, you encourage them to find their own Uncle Cleves or Aunt Cleves or whatever, right? To find their own mentors and create an entrepreneurial support community. It's really, I mean, we've seen some really amazing things here. You know, what Ice House has done. One of the Ice House entrepreneurs, Rodney Walker, was one of the featured entrepreneurs in the program. You know, this kid was held back in school twice. You know, he dropped out without dropping out, basically. He took an entrepreneurship course in 9th or 10th grade. You know, long story short, he's now at Harvard because of the entrepreneurial experience coupled with a mentor. So you want to expose students to people who come from similar or worse circumstances that have succeeded. That's the secret sauce to impacting that audience, in my view.
Absolutely. Real quick, here's an easy one for you. Could you repeat the 2 questions we should ask students instead of what do you want to become? What do you want to be when you grow up? And after we get those answers, where do we go from there?
Well, okay. So stop asking students what they want to be when they grow up. And Nick, maybe you can type this in the chat function to help me out. But start asking them what problems they want to solve and what they need to learn in order to solve those problems. You know, so where do we go from there, right? You know, my wife and I were out the other night on the Case Western Reserve campus, and I wound up talking to a small handful of freshmen that were just, you know, new to Case Western. They were all freshmen. And they're all bright, you know, they're all STEM students, bright kids from all over the country. And I asked them all, I said, what problems are you guys trying to solve? And they all looked at each other like dumbstruck that no one had ever asked them. They were focused on a degree. And, you know, I'm asking educators to ask themselves, tell me what you mean when you say career readiness, right? I don't even know what career means anymore, right? These kids are going to have to learn how to work in fields that don't even exist right now. Like, how can we possibly teach them the skills that they're going to need to survive in a world that we can't even imagine, right? Got to teach them how to find and solve problems in resource constrained circumstances and keep exposing them to people who are doing it.
Absolutely. I do want to be mindful of folks' time since we are just a little past our time. Gary and I are happy to stay on for a few more minutes to answer any last minute questions. There are still a few to get through, but if you need to leave, we are more than happy to let you go. And I do want to let everyone know there will be a recording of this going out within 24 hours, as well as the slide presentation and some links to some of the resources Gary mentioned throughout the presentation. So no worries, you're not missing anything there, and feel free to share those recordings with anyone else that may be interested. So Cynthia is asking, what if I am personally my own case study? My program is about transformation, not just about becoming fit or a diet plan. I changed my mind, body, health, and want to help others in the same. So how could she use herself as kind of an initial case study?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, you know, I think it's powerful to let people know that you've lived it, right? But at the same time, at least in my view, like, I'm not trying to be like a Tony Robbins or something. I'm not trying to say like, I'm a successful entrepreneur, so I know what it takes to become a successful entrepreneur. I think it's helpful that you've got this experience, like you've walked the walk yourself, but I don't think it's necessary to have the experience. I think for those of you who are going to teach entrepreneurship that have never started something, I think that's perfectly fine. Because all this really is a guided process. You're guiding people, you're facilitating discovery. You don't have any idea what they're going to discover in themselves and in the world, right? And so it's just, we have to play the role of the guide on the side, not the subject matter expert.
Absolutely. Okay. Here's an operational question about convincing administrations of the need for these things. How to convince upper admins that students in entrepreneurship are not necessarily going to create businesses, and especially not high growth tech startups, but there's still value in the learning.
Yeah, that's our big challenge there. I really appreciate the question. I do a lot of keynote speaking. I do a lot of professional development for faculty for just that reason, to redefine entrepreneurship as a cognitive framework that every student will need to adapt and thrive in the 21st century. So it's a great question. That's really the big challenge that we're facing at Eli. That's what we do. We help like academic leaders understand this. Like you got to stop thinking about entrepreneurship as a business discipline and look at it as a behavioral phenomenon, right? If you can embrace this entrepreneurial way of thinking, you're going to see a drastic increase in student engagement. And the question really, let me add something to that, Nick. You know, let's go back to what I said in the beginning today about, you know, clinging to the beliefs that once enabled us to succeed while the world is changing all around us, right? That's what that question sort of alludes to, right? Our leadership is clinging to an old way of thinking. And we have to be willing to break from the past. Like, you know, entrepreneurship is not just about learning, it's about unlearning. And that's a tricky thing. Like we've got to like figure out what beliefs and assumptions we have that are no longer useful. And we've got to replace those with new and more effective beliefs.
Absolutely. You hit the point I was going to add on. Mark also points out, back to the socioeconomic conditions factor, to remember the story of Uncle Cleve, if we're using the Ice House story as a good example of reframing the situation as an opportunity, is an important one. Without diminishing the trials and tribulations that we're all going through. It's more to say there's a way forward.
Well, let me say it like this, Nick. You know, I learned something from Martin Seligman very recently, and he calls it the hope circuit. And he actually found that learned helplessness is not learned, it's a default mechanism from evolution, right? When we find ourselves in adverse circumstances, there's a mechanism in our brain that let's call it the hope circuit, that closes off hope. And we now focus our attention on tolerating the situation as it is. By contrast, so our brains reach into our past to decide if we can escape this or we can't. And if we decide that the situation is inescapable, the hope circuit closes so that our body can conserve energy, right? It suppresses the fight or flight response, right? The hope circuit is open, we'll start to generate ideas and we'll start to figure out how to change the circumstances, right? How to escape the situation. And I think this is really important, especially for folks that are working with marginalized people, that the purpose of entrepreneurship education is to open the hope circuit. You know, when you talk to entrepreneurs, you can hear that hope circuit is open. They're saying things like, I got to learn something from this guy. They're saying things like, I got to find a way, right? You can hear it in their language if you go back to the iceberg, right? The hope circuit is open. When you hear the hope circuit is closed, it's yeah, but, right? It's the excuses. It's like, that's what we're trying to do here, is open that hope circuit, and that the guided mastery is really the key to being able to do that. It's a great question. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think that covers all of the main, major questions. There were a few that had some overlap. So, I kind of kludged them together. But then a
Yep.
lot of folks just saying thank you, how useful this was. If anyone has any other questions that you didn't feel were answered effectively or whatever it may be, feel free to reply to that follow-up email that's going out tomorrow. I'll be happy to shoot you an answer or send your questions over to Gary as well.
Yeah, and thank you all for spending your time with us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are in the world this evening. To me, it's a great honor to spend time with you. I would love to have your feedback. If there's anything we can do to help you or your organization become more innovative and entrepreneurial, that's what we do. Thank you for your time this afternoon or today.
Yes. Bryant, just to your question about the standby list, unfortunately, it's not only sold out, but we already have, a couple other folks who are already there. We don't really have a standby list for November training. So keep in touch, because we will be publishing that February. Actually, we already have the February training published. So you'll more than happy to welcome you for that one.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Much appreciated. We got all the questions here, Nick. We good?
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.